chapter 4, right? And then again, chapter. You got to keep track of the. And then chapter 26, right, are very similar. And it's always interesting in discussing the Bible to sort of ask the question: are these doubled stories? Are they the results of multiple traditions, or are they simply, or is it a an artistic decision, right? That this this sort of repetition of the story is a way of sort of feeling stuff about the characters, uh, and so ends up underscoring certain aspects. Um,
God, that scene between David and Jonathan, uh, when he gives him the information, when he tells him to run,
yeah,
um, and he makes this, vow, he says, the Lord is witness between
there's
me and
still a
you and
problem
my
on the
seed
line.
and your seed.
There's a lot of static. I'm sorry, I can't hear well.
the staff seems to be um, accompanying your voice. Is that
Your voice is cracking up a lot and there's static. Last week this happened too, and you did something.
You put headphones on last week and it was much better.
Let me do that again, and I'll put on the headphones, and hopefully that'll help. Hold on one second. Headphones down somewhere, so now I need to find them.
Anyway, it's very moving. That's all I was going to say.
It might help if everybody else muted themselves. I don't know for sure.
Okay.
What is that noise that comes like every 3 seconds, like a roaring lion?
I think it's someone's breathing.
Oh. I feel like I'm in the hospital.
There we go. All right. I hope that's better. Okay, great. So we'll do it this way for now. All right, great. So I just wanted to ask, as we often do, general impressions before we go through the chapters sequentially. Betsy has spoken about the incredibly moving scene right between David and Jonathan that happened in chapter 23, which always is a favorite of mine. But there's also this incredible scene in chapter
20. In chapter 20, I was talking about.
Oh, chapter 20. Okay, yeah. But we're starting today in chapter 24, and looking at where we will be, looking at where Saul and Saul and David, right, are sort of, they have their final interactions, which I find to be so interesting because David is so submissive, right? He's so proper with Saul, calling him father and Lord and king, right? And that seems to elicit some level of at least temporary tshuva from Saul, who wants David to come back. And yeah, go ahead, Connie.
Not on this topic, though.
Okay.
I'm totally intrigued with the character of Abigail. and the amount of space given to her. Because when I think
Yes.
about the women, I think about the other women. I don't really have thought a lot about Abigail until I
Right.
read this. Character,
Right.
a real character
Oh,
of her.
she's an incredible character, and I'm only sad that she just she shows up for this one episode and then she doesn't seem to show up again, which is sad because she's such a fascinating character. All right, so good. So I did want to open it like that so we'll have a chance to look at some of these things, but if there were topics that really caught your attention, please let me know and let the group know what you picked up. The story of Abigail is obviously a big one, but there's other things going on here too.
Hello?
Hello, Phyllis. Go ahead.
Oh, you can hear me. Good.
Yeah.
A question that rose in my mind, which would determine whether I thought it was different traditions or whether it was just the author duplicating something for the sake of duplicating or whatever, is how is the tradition passed on before it got written down? So how did the authors know what words David or Saul probably used?
That's a really good question. I'm assuming that like most, like a lot of traditions, a lot of this stuff was oral. On the other hand, right, this is sort of, at least historical memory, right? And it is really interesting when we get to the question of David defecting to the Philistines, right? Alter raises this question: is David an actual historical figure, or is he sort of a legendary, sort of King Arthur kind of a figure? And when he goes to an old technique, which is called, I forget exactly what it's called, but it basically means like if your hero does something embarrassing, it makes it more likely that he was a real guy, right? So, right, now not that that's determinative in any kind of a way.
Well, I'm asking a slightly different question.
Okay.
Whether or not the whole complete story was made up or whether there was reality behind it is not the question I'm asking. What I'm asking,
I understand, yeah.
What I'm asking is these words, which seem to be so significant. So if David calls Saul king and father, and Saul even calls David son at some points, are these actual words that were remembered, or how did they pass on into tradition? So they.
Yeah. Go ahead. Continue. I don't have a. Go ahead, Betsy.
Respond to that?
Please, yeah, great.
Who's writing this is a great storyteller. So you have to remember that this is a book that's written it's not a text put together by people receiving some monolithic object or someone asking for consensus. It's an inventive, creative storyteller.
Maybe maybe there was some kind of written tradition before the Bible, and I don't know.
I think it's likely, right, because the Bible at different points makes reference to books. There's one, I think it's the book of the battles of the Lord, and there's another book that's mentioned in the book of Numbers, and royal chronicles were a thing, right? So it's quite possible that there were that there were some sort of records of the events that would have coincided, right, with this period in Israelite history. The issue that is sort of looms very large on this right, is that there is very little, if any, sort of archaeological evidence to suggest, these guys. And so it's, despite the fact that there's a place called City of David, right, there's a lot of questions from an archaeological perspective, from a historical perspective. I'm not in any kind of a position.
The story has lasted over 2,000 years. That's a very good story.
It's a great way, and I think, right.
Years.
Right, and I do think that is a very important point, right? That a primary way of thinking about this, right, is that it survives, as a story, and that's one of the reasons it does survive, right? And this sort of dual tradition of Saul being in a position to be killed twice, right, sort of underscores both sort of Saul's unfitness to be king, right, and David's magnanimity. And so I think that having the two versions, even if it is just, well, there were two versions that they didn't want to lose either of them, right, it does have that effect of being, of the doubled story being very effective. And so, sort of first impressions of the woman of Endor, one of my favorite scenes in the whole Bible, right? When Saul goes to for one last conversation with Samuel. Did anyone like that as much as I guess no one did? No one liked it as much as I did. Chapter 28.
But she's pretty good. She's pretty good at what she does.
Yeah.
Summoning up ghosts.
Right, exactly. Well, the thing that I like about it, just to is that she has this relationship with Saul where she feels so worried about him. She wants to take care of him, and and so it's like, Bubba, you haven't eaten.
And there's a lot about eating. In a lot of these stories, somebody hasn't eaten. Samuel's mother didn't eat when she went up to sacrifice. Jonathan didn't eat. Everybody has a period when they don't eat, and then they do eat, and we're told what they eat. And Abigail gives David all these fig cakes and all these wonderful things. There's a lot about food.
Yes, a lot about food. Exactly.
I mean, considering that style is so sparse, it's such a spare style that a large percentage is spent on not eating and then eating and what is actually eaten.
That's true.
And Naval's feast that he has, where he doesn't want to share it with David and his group, and All right, so let's.
I just think that these trespasses that people commit, like Nabal, what's his name, Nabal, whatever, are so minor, and then they're all killed. I mean, people who, the punishment is so severe. I have to be told that this is a very severe crime that these people commit.
Right. I mean, in the story of Abigail, right? It's almost like David is kind of like a mafia don, who's running a protection racket, right? And Nabal doesn't, pay his protection money, and
he doesn't know how important he is or something.
Right.
He doesn't know.
Right. Exactly. And it's sort of like Scarface. He's gonna like pull out. He's gonna know who Scarface is now. So
what good does it do? He's gonna be dead. He won't be able to pay homage to David because he's gonna be dead. Right.
So all right. So let's have a look. So I think one of the things that I find really interesting about the two stories of David and Saul, the first one in the cave and the second one in the camp, right, is the degree to which Saul really and his men really don't seem up to the task, right, of like being a king and the general of an army, right? So like in chapter 26, right, or is that, chapter 26, right? chapter 26, right? David and his henchmen, they just walk right up to the king in the middle of the Israelite camp. I mean, it's and so, granted, okay, the Lord, the sleep of the Lord was upon them, right? But it just seemed, and then that, Saul goes into the cave in order to, to relieve himself. I mean, it's almost like almost like the narrator is laughing at him, right? The poor king had to stop at the rest stop, and while he was there, he met David. I mean, it's almost like a joke, right?
It's surprising to see. I was surprised to see that reference.
Right. Right.
Why, Jean?
Connie, what did you say?
I said why to Jean.
What'd you say?
Yeah, Jean, why? Why were you surprised?
Well,
Connie wants to know.
it's very what's the word? It's a little bit too TMI.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I love it. I just love it. Yeah, I mean we forget, right, that the Bible, like a lot of other ancient texts, right, can be quite forthright about topics that we would find,
It's indelicate. I expect more
indelicate. I like
delicacy.
it.
Okay?
Indelicate, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's I remember there was some movie. I remember when I asked my mother. I think I said, why don't characters in the movies ever go to the bathroom? I asked her, and and it was sort of this recognition, like, oh, it's just not done, right? I mean, obviously there are movies where it is done, but for the most part, like, that's not part of the story, right? It's sort of just assumed, right, that these people have lives. But so I think when we make reference to it in when the Bible makes reference to it, right, I think it's often in this sort of mocking mode. The thing that I'm thinking of right now is the story of Elijah, which happens in the book of Kings, right, where he goes to the prophets of Baal, and they're trying to get Baal to come down and set their bulls on fire. And Elijah mocks them by saying, well, maybe your God is busy. Maybe he's indisposed. Maybe he had to relieve himself. So I do think there's mockery there. Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
When you think about that, he's the king, right? And he's not guarded at all. It also puts him in a very vulnerable position.
Right.
But I guess
Right.
this culture is a lot more risque. It's not as refined. Maybe we don't talk about such things very much. We don't talk about our
Right, and-
presidents or kings having to relieve themselves, but it's just a different culture, and maybe they did talk about it. And what about the
Right,
story of Nabal and the pissers against the wall? What was that?
Right. I mean, I think what he meant there is, David is going to kill all the men, right? He's not going to kill the ladies. He's going to kill all the men. And so anyone who's a pisser, probably more than a pisser, right? A pisser.
Anyone who pisses against the wall is going to get killed.
Right.
Is that how men are
Exactly.
identified?
They're male, right? They're men.
It's a male. He says it's a not. How did Alter put it? It's a almost vulgar expression or something like this.
It's
That it
crude. That's
indicates
the
male.
word. It's crude.
Yeah, crude. A little crude. But I don't know that the culture is so much crude, but I do think it's sort of. I mean, I remember that when in the 2016, right, there was this sudden shift in the New York Times, and because of the Trump candidacy, all of a sudden, the New York Times started printing the word F-U-C-K because Trump would use it, right, in his various speeches, and they just decided, I guess, that we need to print this, right? And so I think that I do think, right, that such language in the Bible is rare. And so when you see it, right, it's pointing to something, right? So Alter is saying, I think, about pisser, right? He's saying, oh, this demonstrates how just rageful David is, right? Because he's using this language, right? And I think, and again, I do think that the idea, right, that the Bible would talk about the king of Israel relieving himself, right, indicates the degree to which Saul is just out of his depth, right? He's just completely, I mean, of course, everyone needs to relieve himself, but you don't go into a cave not without having checked the cave to make sure that it's clear of enemies, right? I mean, that's just, and he puts himself in this vulnerable position, right? Because that, when we're involved in, I mean, whenever I walk the dogs, right, they always have this slightly worried look on their face when they're relieving themselves, because I think they have this sense that at that very moment they're more vulnerable than they would be if when they're just walking around. So all right, so let's go on. Okay, so and so interesting, right? That what does David say about killing Saul? Not going to do it, right? I'm not going to do it, right? Which I find so interesting, because the thing that I keep on bumping up against here in these couple of chapters, right, is that David, in chapters 24, 25, and 26, right, David is restrained in those 3 chapters from an act of violence, right, that would end up hurting him. Go ahead, Connie.
That doesn't prevent him from flaunting that piece of cloth that he tore off.
Right. Oh, yes.
Saul.
Right. I mean, I think the characterization of David here is so interesting, right? Because he seems to have, on one hand, this real sense of his own power, and the possibility of killing Saul, right at this moment, right? And at the same time, he has this sort of remorse about it. And so there's like this, and so there's a way in which you sort of see David as being able to separate himself from impulses, right, and to really weigh the consequences of actions, right? So I think we mentioned this last week, right, that David is aware, right, that if he becomes a regicide and then becomes king, right, he has set up a precedent for the possibility of regicide, right, being an acceptable way to get rid of a king, right? And when he is so in his sort of godfather mode, ready to kill all the Pishers, right, in the house of Nabal, right, Abigail manages to pull him back, right, by saying that this blood guilt would then be upon you, right, and that's going to hold you back, right? So there it's her, right, that saves him from that mistake. But when it comes to Saul, he himself is the one that pulls back on that impulse to do violence. But he does do violence. He does a certain type of violence, right? He cuts the robe, right, which is symbolic of Saul's kingship, right? And that sort of motif of Saul's relationship with cloth, shall we say, is very interesting, right? How he strips one time himself, right? He tears Samuel's cloak, right? And there's that sort of image of the cloak is very, very important. But also, and this is again one of the reasons why I think we have the double story, right, is in the second story, right, we have the spear, right, which is such an important part of Saul's identity, right, as the king. And of course, he's not a very good shot with the spear. He misses David a couple of times, and Jonathan also. But still, for David to take Saul's spear, right, is really an affront So even though it's not violence in the sense of killing Saul, right? I think it reads to Saul as very, as potentially very aggressive. And Saul is very aware, right, of David's reticence to commit that crime, right? Yeah. All right. So I also just wanted to point out in chapter 24 on page 151, right, that Saul has this speech, right, and it'll be the similar structure in chapter 26, right, where David reveals himself to Saul, lets Saul know that I could have killed you, but I didn't, right, and then Saul has this, is that your voice, my son David, right, and those are the words that are repeated that are so, there's in some ways they're so chilling, because you have this image of Saul, who on one hand is dying to kill David, and on the other hand has this very sort of paternal feeling towards him, and is able to basically say, you're right and I'm wrong. And in the way in which in Shaul's sort of bipolar mind, right, they kind of are together. They kind of seem they don't cancel each other out.
Also,
you are more.
It changes because they're face to face. So you
Yes.
can be so much enemy, but this personal contact changes
Right.
everything.
Right, and that act of mercy, right, that Saul is hunting David, right? He's coming from wherever he sits. I forget where he sits, but he's coming from there, chasing David down, and then when he finds him, right, puts himself stupidly in a position to get killed by David, and David doesn't kill him, right? And so there's this sort of mismatch, right, of behavior. And you're right. I think when Saul sees David, right, and is confronted by him, he loses his mojo, right? He loses his urge to kill him, right? Wait, you're right. Why am I chasing you around? Yet another 2 chapters later, he's chasing him around again, right? So so you see why David doesn't trust Saul, right? Because as soon as he's out of sight, right, Saul goes back to chasing him down. Go ahead, Connie.
And the picture of him weeping.
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, and he wept. Oh my God! I'd just like to see a movie of that.
Right.
It's a wonderful scene. I think it's a wonderful
It
scene.
is, right? You are more in the right than I, for it is you who requited me good, whereas I requited you evil. And you told today how you wrought good with me when the Lord delivered me into your hand and you did not kill me. Right? He's like almost amazed, right? He's so moved by David's decision not to kill him, right? For if a man finds his enemy, does he send him off on a good way? Like, who does that, right? The Lord will repay you with good for what you have done for me this day. And so look, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingship of Israel will stay in your hands, right? As opposed to the way that Saul already knows, right, that it's not going to stay in his hands. Right? And now swear to me by the Lord that you shall not cut off my seed after me, and you shall not blot off my name from my father's house. Right? And David made that agreement. Right? As it turns out, right? Yeah, go ahead, Jeannie.
Well, I just think it's interesting that when people make pacts and talk about the future, it's not just between the characters at the moment, but it's always generation after generation. You won't cut off my seed.
Right.
We're talking about your entire house. It's always the long view. Right,
and I think that's among the reasons, right, where we have this constant repetition, this horrifying repetition, right, of when someone goes, and we see this a lot in the book of Joshua. We will see it in chapter 27, also when David goes and defects to the Philistines, right, that there's this tendency to
prohibited.
I'm sorry?
Why they are prohibited. oaths.
Prohibited from what?
Oaths, making oaths like that are prohibited in the Ten Commandments.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So killing all of the inhabitants of the town, right, is the sort of evil obverse of what you're talking about, Jeannie.
Right.
Right?
The long view, wipe them out so they don't
Right.
reproduce.
Wipe them out entirely, right? So they never exist anymore, right? Or you're not going to wipe out my family so that they will exist in perpetuity, right?
Genocide. It has to be genocide, so extermination.
Right. It's all or not. It's an all or nothing kind of view of the world, right? So so we'll see what happens in regards to that. All right. All right. So then the next chapter, right, chapter 25, this is the chapter of Abigail, right? And so Samuel has died, right? And which is not really relevant to this chapter, but it's interesting that it's put here, right? And now we have this sort of very odd story, right, about David. And of course, it's about Abigail also, but the question that I had, and I don't, is like, why is this even here, right? Why is this story included? So, I mean, I have a couple of ideas, but what do you think? Why is this story here?
When David met Abigail.
There we go. Right. Exactly. Right. So, I think is a legitimate answer, right? Like, there's this great female character, right? Who there was a tradition about this woman, Abigail, right? And we had to include this, right? It's such a great story, right? That we need to do it, she is such an amazing character. I mean, for a woman to have a speech that is that long, I mean, most male characters don't have speeches like that, right? It's obviously she's a remarkable person, right? It also goes along with the sort of theme, right, that we see with Michal, right, saving David from Saul, and then now David is being saved from murdering, right? So in a way, like, you can also sort of see that Michal is not just saving David from Saul, but also she also saved Saul from killing David, right? So Saul reads that her action as being against him, right? But there is a way to read it that no, actually she's helping him out too, because that is not blood guilt that he needs. But just that and then the woman in Endor, right, who ends up feeding Saul, is basically like his last meal, right? It's like his pre-execution meal. It's so interesting, right, that these women, when we see women as being such marginalized figures, right? But these three women have such outsized roles in the lives of the rest of the characters. It's really fascinating.
The fact that Abigail, she defies her husband. She doesn't tell him, and she's totally defying him. Also, I think it's interesting that there is such a thing as blood guilt. I mean, it's easy, whole cultures where you just kill people. But here, people need to be saved from killing someone because there will be consequences. I think that's very interesting.
Well, it's so interesting, right, that there would be consequences for in-group killings, right? Out-group killings, like going and destroying a town, right? Like that's all good. But if it's someone who is within your in your social set, so to speak, if you kill them, then you've got blood guilt and you've got a problem. Go ahead, Connie.
Sidebar in the chapters, you see another side of David, which he does not steal the sheep.
Right.
He could have stolen all the guy's sheep. but he doesn't.
Right.
And they make a big
And he
deal about
doesn't,
it.
right? Yes, right, exactly. And so that's another reason, Connie, that I actually hadn't thought of why this story is here. But that is, I had sort of thought like, oh, it sort of shows David as a tough guy and mafioso. But I think what you're suggesting, right, is it goes to show how much David sort of is interested in, I think, what we would in our modern day call virtue signaling, right? He wants everyone to know, right, that he's doing the right thing, right? I didn't steal any of your sheep, right? It's sort of like when Samuel was so upset that the people want a king, right? He says, I didn't take anything from these people, right? He's like, I was a good guy. And David seems to be sort of setting himself up as the righteous outlaw here. Like, yeah, I'm going to steal into Shaul's camp and steal his spear, but I'm not actually going to kill him, right? And I'm gonna sort of take these shepherds under my protection, but I'm actually not going to steal their sheep, right? And so it is. I think that's really interesting. The other reason that I thought of that this story might be here is that it's a great way of separating the two stories about Saul, right? It allows there to be, we have one story about Saul and David in the cave, right? We sort of back up and there's another episode that doesn't have to do with Saul, right? It has to do with Abigail, right? And then we go back to another thing with Saul. So I just want to read a little bit of Abigail's speech, just because I think it's so remarkable, right? So this is on page 155. And so she was riding on the donkey, coming down under the cover of the mountain. And look, I love that. I love that, it's almost like she's saying it, right? The narrator is almost like ventriloquizing her. Look, David and his men were coming down toward her, and she met them. And David said, all in vain did I guard everything, so on and so forth. And Abigail, this is if I leave from all that is his until morning a single pisser against the wall. And Abigail saw David and hurried and got down from the donkey and flung herself on her face before David and bowed to the ground, and she flung herself at his feet and said, I mean, that's a lot of flinging, right? I mean, that's like really, really a lot of flinging, right? I mean, she's really laying it on thick. Mine, my Lord, is the blame, right? I love that. It's my fault, right? But let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Pray, let not my Lord pay mind to this scoundrel of a man, right? This scoundrel of a man, to Nabal. For just like his name he is. His name means base, and baseness is with him. And as for me, your servant, I never saw my Lord's lads whom you sent. So, I mean, you see how long this speech is, right? She just talks and talks and talks.
He's
right?
scared,
And David,
right?
I'm sorry?
Scared. He's scared because
Yeah.
David killed her husband, and she wants to disassociate herself from his sin, his insult.
Right. But what I find amazing, right, is how long this speech is. I mean, it goes from page 156 to page 159, right? So, and even if you are, freaked out, and I mean, she seems way too smart to be babbling, right? And anyway, I don't think the Bible would put up with babbling, right? I think the Bible would say, and she babbled, right? If she were I think that this speech is incredibly well constructed, right? And there's this, and Alter makes the point, right, that there was a suggestion that she's actually trying to spin a web around David, right? That she wants him to rescue her from Nabal, and if he kills Nabal, then he's not going to be able to have her, right? Much better if Nabal just dies. Yeah. Right?
She says, it's not my fault, but I knew nothing about you you know, I didn't
Right.
want
Right, exactly. It's
Yeah.
my fault. It's my fault. But really, it's Nabal. Really, it's Nabal.
It is
I mean,
my
she's
fault. Yeah, it's all my fault, but
Yeah.
I didn't know anything about
Right.
it. All this food I brought.
Exactly.
She's really
Right.
very cunning herself.
She's right. She's very, very clever, and she seems to know that he's going to be the king, right? She seems to have this understanding of who David really is, right? Not just some random. I mean, her husband is like, who is this son of Jesse guy, right? And she's like, oh, you're going to be king. You're a good guy to know, right?
He has a very political and strategic notion of David, of
Yes. Yeah.
of what's happening in terms of you know, the becomingness of a new administration.
Right, right, and that's the other thing, right? That you know we were saying, and I think that it really becomes clear now, right? Is that in a sense, you know, David here is able to sort of see, oh, here is a beautiful woman, right, who is obviously just as smart as I am, right, and also really rich, right, and they can have a very shall we say successful partnership, right, and so
Is she
yes,
beautiful?
well that's what it says, right? It says on page 155. Wait a second. They mention her intelligence and her beauty. But I don't remember
It's
exactly what.
okay. I didn't remember.
Yeah. Lovely looks, and you know, very smart person. Anyway, so and then you know she goes to Nabal, right, and waits. You know, again you sort of see her intelligence, right, because he's all drunk and feasting. She's like, I'm not going to tell him now. I'll tell him tomorrow when he's hungover, right? And what happened? She says, oh, David was here looking for you. He was going to kill you, right? And that's all it takes. And Nabal lets it. You know, yeah, it's like, you know. So it's really, really fascinating. And then at the end, just to point out, just in case you missed it, right, is that Abigail goes to be David's second wife, right? And Ahinoam David had taken from Jezreel, and both of them became his wives, right? But what about his first wife, right, Michal, right? Oh, it turns out that Shaul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, son of Laish, who was from Galim, right? Very interesting, and also very political, right? To you know, I don't think it's really possible, right, for him to sort of reassign Michal as the husband as to another husband, right? But this is what Shaul tries to do. We'll see what happens again then later. All right. Yes, please.
We don't know anything more about Ahinoam, do we?
I don't know if we do. And this is one of those places where you really wish you knew more about Ahinoam, that you wish you knew more about Abigail, right? I would love to see Abigail in action, you know, like, just imagine what kind of, havoc she would wreak. Right. She could be in the court of David. You can imagine that, the mischief she would get into. You kind of want to see that. We'll see Michal again. I don't think we see Abigail again. All right. So then I want to get to chapter 27.
Just out of curiosity, does it say who her sons might have been and what happened with them?
It doesn't say here, and
no, but later on.
I don't think so. I don't. I think at some point Alter says that we don't meet Abigail again. But I don't remember the story well enough, and I made sort of a decision. I'm going to read it along. I'm going to read it sort of along. I'm not going to read the whole thing and have that sort of knowledge. I'm sort of reading it as a page turner every week, which has been really. My gosh, it's just amazing. To sort of be able to revel in a narrative that's this old is really, really amazing. So,
Yeah.
all right, so let's look at chapter 27, right? So here, David finally decides, after 2 opportunities to kill Saul, right, that he better not hope to be spared a 3rd time. So he decides to go back to the Philistines, right, which is really, really interesting, right? You know, it might, you know, the current situation, right, that we're in as a country, where there's the question: did the president know, right, that our primary rival had put a bounty on our soldiers' lives in Afghanistan, right? That is pretty. If that turns out to be true, that's pretty treasonous, right? This is far, far worse, right? This is the future king going to work for the enemy, right? For the arch enemy of the people. So the narrator clearly needs to be very careful with the way he manages this narrative, because it would be very easy to say something quite damning about David. And so we'll see how this all works out, which will be very interesting, to be sure. But what the things that I really pick up in this particular chapter, right, is the fact that David goes not just with his 400 men, right? He now has 2 wives, and he and all of his men, they all go with their households, right? And they sort of occupy a garrison town, right? And they have a whole sort of separate existence in this Ziklag, right? Because they all have a household, which changes the sort of image, right, of a ragtag bunch of misfits, you know, riding around in the desert and living in caves, right? Now everyone's living in a house, and they all have their 2 cars and their cats and their garages, right? I mean, it's a very different kind of an image. It's much less of a sort of itinerant band. Go ahead, Jean.
It's sort of interesting that David is with his 2 wives, Ahinoam and Abigail, the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. He's still identified as David's wife, the wife of Nabal.
Right. Very interesting, right? That it's what do they call it? It's like I don't know exactly why, but my guess, right, is that it's to sort of the memory of that story is always there, right? The memory of how Abigail became David's wife, right? They don't want to lose that, right? So I don't remember where else Abigail's name pops up, so I don't know if this just happens this once, or if it's every time that she's mentioned. I just don't know, but it is really interesting. Yeah, go ahead, Connie.
Here, since he was in a separate place, he'd be able to observe his own religious rites, and he could organize his followers, and he could prevent their assimilation among the Philistines.
Exactly, right. And it's made clear, right, that this town that they inhabit is sort of on the border, right? So it becomes, and it says here on page 169, right? Therefore has Ziklag belonged to the kings of Judah until this day, right? So it becomes a property of Judah, right, of the kingdom of David. And so I think, right, that you're exactly right, Connie, that all of those considerations are active here, right? That to assimilate into the Philistine town, right, would not only involve worshiping their idols, but it would also mean that there would be more likelihood that the guys would become actual Philistine fighters, right, rather than a separate group of Israelites with sort of dual loyalty, right? And that's how, at least in this chapter, right, the biblical author deals with the potential for traitor, for essentially for treason, right? That he insists that David only attacks non-Israelite settlements, right? That he doesn't attack Israelite towns the way Achish thinks he's going to do, right? But he lies to Achish and says that he has, right? So Achish sort of thinks that he's got him. So really, again, David is being incredibly politically slippery, I guess I would say. I would like to think, right, that it was Abigail's idea, right, that he should manage things this way, right? This seems like worthy of her, her kind of subterfuge. Whoa.
Irony.
Yes. Yeah. So, all right. So, So let's look. We can look briefly at chapter 28. I think we'll come back to it next week because it's so worth engaging in this story, right? So now Samuel is dead again, and now Samuel's death is actually relevant, right, to the story. And the other thing that we need to know, right, is that Saul had followed the rules and had outlawed ghosts and familiar spirits, right? So we'll just talk for 1 second about what that means, and then we'll look at the actual story next week, right? So what are ghosts and familiar spirits?
Dream.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
No. Well, at one point they actually say that each family or tribe had its own gods.
Yes. Right.
So how does that square with one God?
You've got this is the sort of the joy and the challenge of reading the Bible, right? That you've got whole strands of the Bible that are insisting upon a very, very strict form of monotheism, right? But you've got many other traditions that are included in the Bible, right, that are not strictly monotheistic, right? Some of them, and we see this played out again and again, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, right, and other places in the Torah, right? The sort of battle between idolatry and monotheism, right? But I think one of the reasons for that, right, is because the use of idols was so widespread.
Forest spirits isn't idolatry, is it?
Well, that's actually a great question, right? Because what is the point of we know this just from chapter 28, right? Why does Saul approach the spirit of Samuel, right? To get from him what he couldn't get from talking to God, right? God is no longer talking to Saul, right?
Yeah.
There's no prophet, right?
Right.
There's no prophet. He doesn't have access to the priests. Remember, he killed them all, right? He killed all the priests, and the priest's son took the Urim and Thummim and went to hang out with David, right? So Saul lost that method, right, of divination, right? So Saul is completely out of the know, right? And so one of the things, right, obviously Saul was trying to play by the rules here, and get. Go ahead.
But that's been a theme from the very beginning that he doesn't. That there's a spiritual flaw in him.
Yes, right. I mean, exactly. That right from the very beginning, right? He never seems to know what's going on, right? Even when he has Samuel's ear, right? He always seems to be sort of a day late and a dollar short, knowing what's going on, right? And so this whole scene, I think, is so interesting, and we'll get to it next week, right? Because it's the one time right, where he gets very, very clear information from a spiritual source, right? He learns what's going to happen, right, in a way that is always denied him previously, right? He always seems to be out of it, and finally he's given full information. Unfortunately, what he's given, right, is a death sentence. Like, by tomorrow, you're going to be down here with me, right? So it's sort of unfortunate what he hears, but it is interesting that that you know, he actually gets what he wants from Samuel in a way that he was not able to get previously, which is just a sort of interesting thing to think about.
Yeah.
Right. So I do think in that sense, Betsy, that it is it's in a sense kind of idolatry.
I
Right?
see.
Because part of the connection to God, right, is this divination. And
Right.
if you use alternative forms of divination, then you are skirting God.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So anyway, so we'll start here. Let's go to the end of we'll go to the end of chapter. Let's see. Let's go to the. Let's read through chapter 1 of the second book of Samuel. So we'll start 28, 29, 30, 31, and then the first book of the first chapter of the second book. All
Okay.
right, does that sound good? All right,
Okay.
perfect.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks everybody.
Bye.
Have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Are you ever in Brookline?
I almost never in Brookline. I as soon as I can come back to Brookline, I'll let you know. I'm going to try to make that happen ASAP. But we just had a whole conversation today about how they are really worried about people moving from campus to campus. I really don't think it's a problem because I'm not sitting with people in Brookline. But I can sit. I'm not going into people's apartments and so on and so forth, but I have to convince them that I should be allowed to come back. Yeah.
And could I ask you a question? Then you as
Yeah.
a rabbi, you are allowed to go into people's apartments, right?
I'm allowed to do what?
You're allowed, permitted to go into someone's apartment because you're the rabbi?
Right now, the issue is the COVID. The issue is the COVID. I can go. I could be in Brookline and go into people's apartments and so on and so forth, like with social distancing and masking and all that sort of stuff. But if I'm also in Rosendale visiting that even more vulnerable population, they don't want me going back and forth. So, but my point is I can be in Brookline and just sit in my office and not go into people's apartments, and I don't see why I can't do that, but they're being very strict about it.
But
So,
if people, you mean,
I'm
so that people would come to talk with you in your office, you mean? To visit in your office?
Right. I mean, I could do that, but I would have to be outside. Like I could meet
because
people.
your office is very small. It's a small.
My office is right. It's definitely not enough room to be socially distanced in there.
Yeah.
Okay,
So
if
no,
you
I'd have to meet people in hallways or in elevator lobbies or whatever.
Or in the art room, or.
Exactly.
I still have these 3 chronicles.
I know. I promise that when I come, I'll come and get them. All right.
Thank
Sounds
you.
good, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.